On March 28, 2026, at 04:30 hours, the largest Israeli ground offensive since 1982 began with simultaneous breaches across 14 crossing points along the Israel-Lebanon border. 3 division-strength forces, approximately 45,000 IDF troops supported by 600 tanks and 200 artillery pieces, advanced into southern Lebanon with orders to destroy Hezbollah military infrastructure within a 30-kilometer security zone. The operation, designated Second Shield, had been planned for months following escalating rocket attacks that killed 89 Israeli civilians since January and displaced over 200,000 from northern communities. What planners anticipated as a 3 to 5 day operation to neutralize Hezbollah positions became, within 24 hours, the bloodiest single day of combat Israel had experienced since the Yom Kippur War. By 23:59 hours, 350 Israeli soldiers were dead, over 800 wounded, and invasion forces that had advanced confidently that morning were fighting desperately to hold positions against Hezbollah counterattacks, exploiting every advantage, terrain, preparation, and motivation provided. The decision to launch ground operations into Lebanon had been debated within Israeli political and military leadership for weeks. Airstrikes against Hezbollah positions had been ongoing since February, destroying rocket launchers, weapons depots, and command facilities. But intelligence assessments indicated that Hezbollah retained substantial capability, including an estimated 80,000 rockets and missiles, sophisticated anti-tank weapons, and well-fortified defensive positions built specifically to resist Israeli ground invasion. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faced pressure from coalition partners demanding decisive action to stop rocket fire, and from military commanders warning that ground operations in Lebanon would be costly and complex. The decision to proceed came after a particularly deadly rocket barrage on March 25th killed 23 people in Haifa, creating political imperative for visible response. The operational plan called for rapid advance to seize key terrain, destruction of Hezbollah positions within the security zone, and establishment of fortified positions that could be held with reduced forces while the bulk of troops withdrew. The plan assumed Hezbollah would resist but would be overwhelmed by Israeli firepower and training. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The invasion began with artillery barrage at 0400 hours, 5,000 rounds impacting suspected Hezbollah positions across the border region. Airstrikes followed, F-15s and F-16s hitting targets identified through weeks of surveillance. At 0430, the first Israeli units crossed the border. The 36th Division advanced toward the town of Marun al-Ras, a strategic position overlooking the border that Hezbollah had fortified extensively. The Golani Brigade moved toward Bint Jbeil, a larger town that Israeli forces had fought over during the 2006 war, and armored units from the 7th Brigade pushed north toward the Litani River, attempting to reach positions from which they could interdict Hezbollah supply routes. Initial progress was rapid. By 0600 hours, Israeli units had advanced 3 to 5 kilometers into Lebanese territory, encountering limited resistance and reporting objectives being achieved ahead of schedule. Commanders reported optimism. Intelligence had been accurate about Hezbollah positions. Air support was effective. The operation was proceeding according to plan. At 0647 hours, everything changed. An entire company from the 36th Division, advancing through agricultural areas south of Marun al-Ras, triggered a massive improvised explosive device that Hezbollah had buried beneath a dirt road. The explosion, estimated at over 500 kilograms of explosives, destroyed 3 Merkava tanks and 2 armored personnel carriers instantly. 19 soldiers were killed in the initial blast. Before the survivors could react, Hezbollah fighters emerged from concealed positions and engaged with anti-tank missiles and automatic weapons. The company, disorganized and taking casualties, called for support. Artillery fire was directed at suspected Hezbollah positions, but fighters had already withdrawn into tunnel systems that intelligence either hadn't identified or had assessed as less extensive than they actually were. By 0730 hours, the company had sustained 34 casualties and had been forced to withdraw, abandoning several damaged vehicles that couldn't be recovered under fire. The pattern repeated across the invasion front. Israeli units advancing on what appeared to be lightly defended territory were ambushed by Hezbollah fighters using tactics developed over years of preparation. Anti-tank teams armed with Russian Kornet missiles engaged Israeli armor from concealed positions, firing and withdrawing before Israeli forces could return effective fire. Sniper teams targeted officers and radio operators, degrading Israeli command and control. And everywhere Israeli troops advanced, they encountered IEDs, some simple command-detonated explosives, others sophisticated devices triggered by pressure plates or infrared sensors. The terrain favored defenders. Southern Lebanon is characterized by hills, valleys, olive groves, and small towns with stone buildings that provided excellent cover. Israeli armor, designed for open desert warfare, struggled in confined spaces where Hezbollah fighters could engage from multiple angles. And air support, while available, was limited by rules of engagement requiring positive identification before strikes, difficult when Hezbollah fighters operated in civilian areas and wore no uniforms. By 0900 hours, casualty reports arriving at Northern Command headquarters painted an alarming picture. Every division engaged in the invasion was reporting significant contact with Hezbollah forces. The optimistic assessments from early morning had been replaced by urgent requests for medical evacuation, artillery support, and airstrikes. Major General Yair Golan, commanding Northern Command, faced a decision. He could order units to consolidate positions, accepting that the rapid advance envisioned in operational plans wasn't achievable against the resistance being encountered. Or he could commit reserves, pushing additional forces into Lebanon to maintain momentum. Golan chose to commit reserves. Elements of the 98th Division, held back as exploitation force, received orders to cross the border and support units in contact. The decision reflected doctrine that emphasized offensive action and confidence that additional forces would overcome resistance. But it also meant more Israeli soldiers would be exposed to the ambushes and IED attacks that were already causing devastating casualties. The fight for Bint Jbeil became the day's most intense combat. The Golani Brigade, advancing on the town from 3 directions, encountered Hezbollah defenders who had transformed the area into a fortress. Buildings had been reinforced with concrete and steel. Underground bunkers connected by tunnels allowed fighters to move unseen. Weapons caches had been positioned throughout the town. And Hezbollah had studied Israeli tactics from previous wars, developing counter-tactics specifically designed to negate Israeli advantages. As Golani units entered the outskirts of Bint Jbeil at 1,000 hours, they were engaged by coordinated fire from multiple positions. Anti-tank missiles struck lead vehicles, machine gun fire swept streets. Snipers targeted soldiers attempting to dismount from vehicles. The brigade commander, Colonel David Shapira, ordered his units to bypass the town and continue toward objectives further north. But Hezbollah fighters in Bint Jbeil continued engaging Israeli forces, preventing withdrawal and forcing commitment of additional units to suppress fire and extract casualties. By noon, the Golani Brigade was engaged in urban combat across a 2-square-kilometer area of Bint Jbeil. Infantry squads fought building to building, clearing rooms and advancing through rubble under constant fire from defenders, who knew every alley and vantage point. Combat engineers attempted to breach walls to create covered routes between positions, but IEDs hidden in buildings killed teams attempting demolitions. Tank main guns fired at suspected Hezbollah positions, destroying buildings, but often failing to neutralize fighters who had already moved to alternate positions through tunnels. Helicopter gunships provided support, but distinguishing Hezbollah fighters from civilians in the chaotic urban environment was nearly impossible without ground controller guidance, and many forward observers had been killed or wounded in the fighting. By 1400 hours, the Golani Brigade had sustained 67 casualties, including 23 killed, and had advanced less than 300 meters into Bint Jbeil. The colonel commanding one of the engaged battalions reported to brigade headquarters, "We're in knife fight range. Every building is defended. Casualties are mounting faster than we can evacuate. Without significant reinforcement and changed tactics, we cannot achieve the objective." The casualties were overwhelming medical services. Field hospitals established just inside Lebanese territory were receiving wounded faster than surgeons could operate. Helicopters evacuated critical cases to hospitals in Israel, but landing zones near fighting were under sporadic fire, forcing pilots to approach at high speed and depart immediately after loading casualties. Some wounded waited hours for evacuation, while medics provided emergency treatment, under conditions where any movement attracted fire. Staff Sergeant Yonatan Klein, a combat medic with the Golani Brigade, later described treating a soldier who had lost both legs to an IED. "I was performing amputation stabilization in a basement while Hezbollah fighters fired into the building above us. The wounded were lying in lines waiting for helicopters that couldn't land because the LZ was taking RPG fire. We lost patients not because medicine failed, but because we couldn't get them to surgery fast enough." That's the reality of what that day was. Not a surgical operation, a bloodbath. By mid-afternoon, Israeli forces across the invasion front were facing the same tactical problem. They had advanced into positions where Hezbollah could engage them from prepared defenses, while Israeli advantages in firepower and technology were negated by terrain and Hezbollah tactics. The 7th Brigade, pushing toward the Litni River, had been halted by a series of ambushes that destroyed 8 tanks and forced the brigade to establish defensive perimeter rather than continue advancing. The 36th Division, bloodied in the morning's IED attack, was pinned down by mortar fire and couldn't maneuver without exposing units to additional ambushes. And throughout the operational area, small Hezbollah teams were infiltrating behind Israeli lines, attacking supply convoys, firing rockets at Israeli territory from positions close to the border, and creating chaos that forced Israeli units to divert forces to rear area security rather than focusing on objectives. At 1600 hours, Major General Golan convened emergency conference call with division commanders to assess the situation and determine whether to continue operations or consolidate and reassess. The reports were uniformly grim. Every division was sustaining casualties at rates that weren't sustainable. Medical evacuation was struggling to keep pace. Ammunition expenditure, particularly for tank main gun rounds and artillery shells, was exceeding planned rates because targets required multiple engagements to destroy. And intelligence assessments of Hezbollah strength had clearly been wrong. Instead of the estimated 5,000 fighters intelligence had predicted in the invasion zone, Israeli forces were encountering what commanders estimated as 15,000 to 20,000 combatants, suggesting Hezbollah had reinforced heavily in anticipation of invasion. Golan ordered units to halt advance, consolidate positions, and prepare for possible withdrawal if casualty rates didn't decrease. The order represented acknowledgement that the operation's objectives weren't achievable under current conditions. But halting didn't mean safety. Hezbollah, recognizing that Israeli forces had stopped advancing, launched counterattacks designed to inflict maximum casualties and force Israeli withdrawal. At 17:30 hours, Hezbollah fighters assaulted positions held by elements of the 36th Division near Maroun al-Ras. The attack was preceded by mortar barrage that disabled several Israeli vehicles and killed crews attempting to dismount. Then fighters advanced using terrain for cover, engaging Israeli positions with RPGs and small arms, while anti-tank teams fired Kornet missiles at any vehicle that presented a target. The Israeli unit, already weakened by morning casualties, fought desperately to hold position. Artillery fire was called in danger close, impacting within 50 meters of Israeli positions to break up Hezbollah assault. Attack helicopters engaged fighters they could identify, but twilight conditions made target identification difficult, and pilots were reluctant to fire on targets that might be Israeli soldiers. The battle lasted 90 minutes. When Hezbollah withdrew at 1900 hours, the Israeli unit had lost an additional 31 soldiers killed and 47 wounded. The position had held, but at catastrophic cost. As darkness fell, Israeli commanders faced a tactical dilemma. Operating at night offered some advantages, particularly for units equipped with thermal imaging and night vision equipment that Hezbollah largely lacked. But darkness also meant increased risk of friendly fire, greater difficulty evacuating wounded, and reduced effectiveness of air support. Most units established defensive positions and prepared for night operations, focused on holding ground rather than advancing. But Hezbollah wasn't content to let Israeli forces consolidate. Throughout the night, small teams probed Israeli positions, attempting to identify weak points and inflict casualties through harassing attacks. Israeli sentries, exhausted from day-long combat and traumatized by casualties they had witnessed, fired at any sound or movement, expending ammunition on targets that often turned out to be animals or shadows. The stress of maintaining alert through the night, knowing that Hezbollah fighters might be approaching from any direction, degraded combat effectiveness and contributed to mounting psychological strain on units that had been in combat for over 18 hours. Political reaction was immediate and intense. As casualty numbers reached 350 by evening, public shock turned to anger. How had an operation characterized as proceeding successfully that morning resulted in the highest single-day death toll since 1973? Opposition politicians demanded emergency Knesset session. Families flooded military notification centers. Demonstrations formed in Tel Aviv demanding either immediate withdrawal or commitment of overwhelming force to complete the operation quickly. Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the nation at 2100 hours, speaking from the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem before cameras broadcasting to a country in shock. His statement acknowledged the severity of casualties while defending the necessity of the operation. Today was the hardest day Israeli soldiers have faced in over 50 years. 350 families received the worst news any family can receive. Hundreds more are waiting in hospitals, praying for wounded sons and daughters to survive. This is the cost of defending our country against an enemy that seeks our destruction. Hezbollah has fired thousands of rockets at Israeli cities, killed our civilians, and built an army on our northern border dedicated to our annihilation. We cannot allow this threat to persist. The operation will continue until Hezbollah's military infrastructure is destroyed and our northern communities can live in security. The price is terrible, but the alternative, living under constant threat of attack, is unacceptable. We will not abandon our soldiers in Lebanon. We will complete the mission, and we will ensure that no Israeli soldier died in vain. The statement did little to calm public anxiety. Critics pointed out that Netanyahu had authorized the operation despite warnings from some military commanders that casualties would be high and objectives might not be achievable quickly. The comparison to the 2006 Lebanon War, which had been politically disastrous for Israeli leadership and militarily inconclusive, was made repeatedly in media coverage. And the question of whether Israel could sustain an extended ground campaign in Lebanon while simultaneously maintaining operations in Gaza created strategic concern among analysts who worried that Israel was overextending military capabilities. By midnight on March 28th, opinion polls showed that 62% of Israelis supported the Lebanon operation, but 58% believed casualties were higher than anticipated, and 45% expressed concern that the operation lacked clear, achievable objectives. For soldiers in Lebanon, political debates were irrelevant compared to the immediate struggle to survive and care for wounded comrades. Lieutenant David Levi, commanding a platoon from the Golani Brigade trapped in Bint Jebel, spent the night of March 28th in a partially collapsed building with 14 soldiers, 3 of whom were wounded and in need of medical evacuation that couldn't be arranged because helicopters couldn't land near the position. He later described the experience. "We had no food because the supply convoy that was supposed to reach us had been ambushed. We had limited ammunition because we'd expended most of it during the day. We had wounded who needed surgery we couldn't provide, and every hour or so, Hezbollah would fire an RPG at our building to remind us they knew we were there. The question wasn't whether we would complete the mission. The question was whether we would survive until morning. That was the reality for probably hundreds of Israeli units across Lebanon that night, isolated under fire, waiting for support that might or might not come. The casualty count of 350 killed was preliminary and would eventually be revised upward as additional bodies were recovered and soldiers who died of wounds in subsequent days were added to the toll. But even the initial number represented catastrophic loss for a military and society where every casualty is deeply felt and where operations are planned to minimize friendly losses. The IDF had lost more soldiers in one day than during entire previous operations, including the 2006 Lebanon War, which had resulted in 121 Israeli combat deaths over 34 days. The casualties came from across Israeli society. Officers and enlisted, regular soldiers and reservists, men and women, veterans and soldiers on their first combat deployment. Unit cohesion that normally helped soldiers cope with combat stress was shattered in companies that had lost 30 or 40% of their strength in a single day. Survivors dealt with trauma from witnessing friends killed, from making decisions under fire that resulted in casualties, and from the profound psychological shock of experiencing combat intensity for which training hadn't prepared them. By dawn on March 29th, the invasion forces that had crossed into Lebanon 24 hours earlier had achieved almost none of their objectives, but had sustained losses that forced immediate operational reassessment. Instead of advancing to the Litani River and establishing security zone, Israeli units held tenuous positions 3 to 8 kilometers inside Lebanon, surrounded by Hezbollah fighters, and depended on constant air support and artillery fire to prevent being overrun. Instead of destroying Hezbollah infrastructure, Israeli forces had discovered that infrastructure was far more extensive and better defended than intelligence had assessed. And instead of creating conditions for rapid achievement of political objectives, the operation had created domestic political crisis and international criticism of civilian casualties that Israeli strikes on Hezbollah positions in populated areas had inevitably caused. The second front that Israel had opened with confidence that morning had exploded into catastrophe, proving once again that military operations rarely proceed according to plan when facing a determined enemy fighting on prepared ground with motivation that matched or exceeded that of attackers, making March 28, 2026, a day that would be remembered in Israeli military history not as triumph, but as warning about the costs of underestimating adversaries and the dangers of opening fronts where victory's price exceeds what even determined nations can bear.